Joining me live now, Dr. Matthew Sussex from ANU's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre for more on this. So, as the government's been emphasising, they're not, the sea mines are not the same ones as we used to use many years ago. What do you make of using this? Is it a good modern deterrence? Is it just all about making Australia again a bit more of a porcupine when it comes to invasion?
Yeah, look, it's effectively selecting from a whole bunch of different capabilities and systems that you can in order to try and make Australia more of a prickly target. And I think these sea mines are, a fairly low cost and fairly simple, additive to defence's overall strategy about, trying to keep the sea lanes of communication safe. You're absolutely right to say that they're not like they were. They're not just floating bombs. They can be selected quite carefully for things that they detonate. They can be remotely controlled. They can be remotely disarmed as well. So they're slightly more modern than they used to be.
Yeah, one would hope so. I suppose there's so much talk, for example, of submarines. We know the eye-watering cost, or the ballpark of that cost at least, 100 billion or so. And, even missile defence is expensive. It's important to have tools that are much cheaper, right? Because defence is always very multi-layered. It's about bang for buck, because the amount we spend on defence will never be able to compete with the really big players in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is, sort of the idea to diversify the various tools you've got at the disposal is, I think, a pretty sensible one. The decision to acquire these mines was certainly launched a while ago. It was launched on the previous government, in fact, but it's been fast-tracked here. So whereas things like, AUKUS submarines might grab all the headlines, in a lot of cases, it's things like, the purchase of the tried and true HIMARS system for the army that's been so effective in Ukraine, and things like mines that will help give defence the kind of edge that it needs. Because as you say, we cannot compete one-on-one with the big players. Our only real hope is to, make sure our alliances are tight, and at the same time have lots of different capabilities that might make an adversary think twice before deciding to compromise our interests.
You mentioned there Ukraine. Obviously, the country's in the depths of winter. We always thought this would be a testing time. How do you think this is poised, both in terms of what's happening in the battle itself, but also strategically? How much is left in the tank for Ukrainians to fight on, and how long Vladimir Putin's willing to go on as well?
Look, I think both sides have demonstrated that they're prepared to keep on going as long as it takes. If you're Ukrainian, you're prepared to go on as long as it takes, because it's your territory. If you're Vladimir Putin, you have a kind of unending stream of people who you can use to mobilise and basically throw inhuman waves at the Ukrainians as cannon fodder, because you haven't achieved the goals that you set out at the start. So I think this conflict really does have quite a long way to go yet, which raises some interesting questions, particularly in the West. What is the Western strategy for this conflict? If we are going to be aiding the Ukrainians, then do we give them all the systems that they're asking for in order to help them repel the Russians? Or alternatively, is there other views? And I think recently we've seen some sort of differing views between Germany on the one hand and some of the other Western partners on the other.
Yeah, and that's been fascinating, because Ukraine's saying they've got their eyes on these Leopard tanks, but the Germans not committed to supplying them. For all the incredible grit and determination of Ukraine, the reality is, without assistance from the West, they wouldn't have much of a defence anymore, I don't think, at this point. So how is that playing out at the moment?
Well, the British decided about a week ago to send 14 of their Challenger tanks to Ukraine, kind of, just to break the ice, because previously there'd been loads of debate about, sending tanks to Ukraine. The German position is this would be a dangerous escalation, that, nuclear war could be the result. Personally, I think that's going really a bit too far. There's a lot of steps before you get to thermonuclear war with Russia, assuming that Vladimir Putin wants to commit suicide. But the German decision to hold up these tanks is having knock-on effects on countries like Poland and Finland, which have Leopards and are more than willing to give them to the Ukrainians. Ultimately the Ukrainians are going to need them if they're going to push the Russians out. They're also going to need them if the Russians restart their offensive, which, judging by most reports, that's what they're gearing up to do within the next month or so.
Yeah, that's sort of on the cusp of spring offensive. It's been fascinating the war itself, because yes, we've got sort of the high-tech elements around these longer-range missile strikes, but tanks being crucial, and also reports at the moment of these muddied trenches and soldiers, in particular Russians, even charging across no man's land. I mean, it sounds like the First World War. Why has it gone so old school?
Yeah, I mean, this is not the kind of postmodern war that many expected as the next land war that we'd see. And part of the reason for that is simply because things like artillery and things like tanks are still very valuable when it comes to places like the Ukrainian steppes. You don't have an awful lot of cover. It's very flat farmland, we've seen a sort of regression to the very old school kind of trench warfare and infantry advances on foot. Now that means, of course, that it also becomes much more deadly and much more lethal. Particularly if you're a mobilized Russian or you're in a Russian jail and you decide to join the Wagner group in order to get your sentence commuted. I mean, these people are just being sent in human waves. And many reports suggest that the death toll and the injury toll, the people who've just been maimed as a result of being thrown in there, is just absolutely horrendous.
Yeah. I guess when you're harking back to the First World War, that's what it was, brutal, and many people just cannon fodder. We know so much through the experience as well. Matthew Sussex, great to have your thoughts as usual. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Cheers.